Okay, welcome to Stillness and Chaos. Elaine, a warm welcome to you. Um, we've maybe I thought I'll start with a song. I want to sing you a song
No, this
because
is a
it's
surprise.
6:30
I
a.m. in the
didn't know that
morning.
you were going to sing me a song. Well, do I get to sing a song back? I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't have a guitar. Oh no, you don't. I don't get to. All right.
well, you woke up at 6:30 a.m. for me, so this is the least I can do. It's
Okay.
been a hard day's night, and I've been working like a dog. It's been a hard day's night. I should be sleeping like a log. So when I get onto you, I find the things that you do. You know I feel you are alright. You know I work all day to get the money to buy you things. And it's work just to hear you say, I'm gonna give me everything. So when I get onto you, I find the things that you do. You know I feel you are alright.
Well, I mean, what a way to start with the Beatles. Those are the songs from my childhood.
Yeah. Um, I grew up with a lot of Beatles as well, even though we are a couple of generations apart.
Yeah, a
But
couple.
thank you for waking up at 6:30 a.m. in the morning and doing this.
You're very.
We've got Elaine, we've got Poe. Poe is a reminder that we shouldn't take ourselves too seriously because we've got a big, important, sometimes very serious conversation to have. And he's just soft and cuddly. For those who don't know me, I'm Daniel. I'm the founder and CEO of Because You. I and we truly believe that all of us are wise, creative, joyful human beings. And sometimes, the emotional distress, a mental health issue, um, grief kind of clouds who we are as human beings. So it's my life's purpose to find different ways to support other people on this journey of seeing themselves as human beings, right? And showing up with kind of the highest creative potential, which in my words is kind of, how do I unleash the wisdom, joy, love in the world. So stillness and chaos is one of the ways I'm looking to do this. I've got awesome guests like Elaine every 2 weeks, and we have different topics. Today is healing trauma in a divided world. Trauma is a big word. It's a big topic. We're gonna, go into a couple of aspects, but our aim is to just get people really curious about this topic and start to work on it a little bit. So Elaine, I'd love to do a little bit of an intro,
Okay.
if that's okay. So Elaine, you're the co-founder and director of innovation at the Trauma Resource Institute. You've been doing this work for an amazing amount of time. You're really passionate about I don't mean that in a bad
Yeah,
way.
I'm
um,
getting older by the minute, Daniel. Yes.
but you've got this passion about healing trauma in communities, right?
Yeah.
Especially communities where there's a lot of difficulty. And what you've been able to do with the Trauma Resource Institute, with the models that you've developed, is make working on these big topics very accessible to lots of different people. Um, so you're an amazing social entrepreneur. It's been a pleasure knowing you. You're an author, you're a radio show host, your mom, and I don't know if you have grandchildren, but
I do have a wonderful grandchild. Yes.
yes, and yeah, and I was really struck by during when the Ukraine war started. You started this Ukraine resiliency humanitarian kind of work, which is working with people in the war zone to really
Mhm.
think of how do you work with trauma, right? So I think there are so many different aspects that I love to kind of talk to you about today. But yeah, just welcome to Stillness and Chaos.
Well, I'm
Really,
very honored to be here, and I'm so glad that we met through our um, shared interest in Catalyst 2030
yeah,
and through our dear friend Chris Underhill. So,
yes, I'm your friend.
yes.
And on a personal note, I think you're just a beautiful human being, and you've always been there for me when I've needed it, when I've dealt with my own big trauma.
Yes,
So
we've had some wonderful conversations, Daniel. Yes.
thank you. So for welcome to people who are watching. Um, who will watch this later on YouTube, there's one way you can kind of engage, which is where we love you to kind of just share comments, questions, so that we know kind of people are out there. Elaine and I have no idea if anyone's out there. We can go on talking till the cows come home. So please engage with us. This really important topic. But Elaine, let's start by getting to know you a little bit on a perhaps a personal note, right? You're a really accomplished social entrepreneur. You're doing these million things. You've had an amazing life in many different ways, and yeah, and I'm sure you're a complex, layered person. So if you had to think about one important aspect of who or what has shaped you, maybe
Well,
you can start there and then move.
I have to say that I don't think it's one, but I think it was my family. And my mother and my grandmother immigrated to the United States from El Salvador. And I think growing up in a family that was bicultural, my dad grew up on a farm in Montana, so he was an American. But it was definitely a clash of different cultures at times. But there was also a richness of learning about Latin culture but here living in the United States and having two wonderful, especially my grandmother as a role model. And even though there were challenges in my family, I'll have to say that, because when we say what shapes you, I think my mother had some mental health challenges. And and my father had a problem with alcohol. But I have to say, even though they had these challenges, it does not take away from the richness and the love that they gave to me. My dad eventually got into recovery from his alcoholism, which was a great relief, of course, to everyone. But I think that I learned from my family a certain sense of, I think it was really brave when my dad finally said, I have to get a handle on this. There's some people that live their whole life that don't. But I think because there was trauma that was not treated, that affected both my mom and my dad, that I think that had me start to think at a very young age about how to help people. But there was, it's so funny that you say this. There was one seminal moment. I was in El Salvador as an 11-year-old child. And in the part of California where I lived, I never saw poverty, even though, of course, poverty exists everywhere. But I was in the streets with my family, and we came upon an open market, and there was clearly a woman with a small baby that was begging for food, begging for money, but she looked very frail and thin and malnourished. And I remember that moment. I can see it right now here, many years later, thinking that why isn't someone helping her? And here, many years later, I've helped many people.
Wow.
I think there was that compassion that I felt as a young person towards people that were suffering. So that was one that I remember.
What a beautiful moment. Yeah, we can hold that person in our heart. She's made a huge difference to the world through you.
Yes. That's true, isn't it? That sometimes people don't even know the difference that we might be making in their lives by a simple gesture or by just an observation.
And I think I'm struck also by what you said about your dad making the effort and doing the work, because I feel that has such a big impact, right, on the kids, on on yourself as well. And I'm just curious, like, if you, now that you know the work and you know the trauma and you work with so many thousands of people, if you had to think about just perhaps some of the ways that it's manifested in your life, that dynamic of your dad and your mom, and how he's worked on it and how it's showing up in you today.
Well, I think that, seeing them made me feel that, especially with my dad, well, even with my mom, I have to say, but that recovery is possible. So there might have been a time in my life that I wouldn't have thought that would be true. But I think that also is really a tributary to hope. And that there's a hopefulness that even sometimes during the most difficult of times, that sometimes we can snatch a little bit of hope. And you mentioned like our Ukrainian humanitarian resiliency project. I have been so touched by the Ukrainians, and in fact, I met with some of them yesterday, and I just, in terms of their resilience, their ability to keep going, to keeping in mind what nourishes the heart, the soul, and the mind. I work a lot with teachers in Ukraine, and they're so dedicated, not only in helping the minds and learning all the things about mathematics, literature, but how to take care of their dear little souls and hearts and bodies, because they've had to live through such a terrible time of war. So that has been such a hopeful observation for me. And, I've provided the support, by the way, not in person, through these kinds of platforms that to me is one of the amazing things about technology. that we can respond with the models we've created, the community resiliency model and the trauma resiliency model during war, giving people tools to help them get through what could only be said as one of the most difficult situations. It doesn't have to be after the fact. And that to me is very hopeful. And that's linked to that hope that I learned about at quite an early age.
Wow, I love that. Tributary of hope. I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to make a t-shirt on that. Okay, just one second. So Suresh says, thanks for arranging. Looking forward to... Thanks, Suresh. Welcome. Before we go into the work of TRI, as well as, pick your brains a little bit on the nitty-gritty, I think, trauma is... Like, I'm hearing trauma, the word trauma, everywhere. Right? It feels like it's the new buzzword in, like, whether it's mental health practitioners, whether it's, kind of people saying, I've been traumatized, there's too much trauma, I've been triggered, there's lots of stress, all that stuff. It feels like everyone is using it very colloquially. And, I feel some of us don't even know what trauma is. So I'd love to, just start with the basics, because some of us who are watching this and will watch this later are also thinking about what is trauma, what really is trauma.
Well, I'm going to talk. Okay, go ahead.
No,
well, let me start first. That, because I speak to people all over the world of all ages, of all different kinds of backgrounds, sometimes people that have the most education in the world, sometimes people who have not had the advantages of education and may not be able to read and write. So I've found that sometimes it helps to be the simplest possible. So what is trauma? It's something that happens to us that can be too much, too fast. That can be an earthquake. That can be a car accident. That can be living in a relationship where you surprisingly get hit by someone. It also can be too little for too long. And that could be child maltreatment. Too little for too long could be food insecurity. Too little for too long can be not being nourished by other connectedness in your life that ends up leaving you with this feeling inside that there's something incredibly wrong with you because of not having had those kinds of nurturing relationships. But it also can be too much for too long. I could say that's happening in Ukraine right now. I feel a little bit of that, somewhat traumatized by our political situation in the United States. It's been too much for too long. We need some respite and need some kindness and generosity that's also amplified in our media, not only the hate that's there. Because I think that kind of stress is all over the world. We know that in India, there's political stress. I mean, there's all sorts of stress. There's macro level stress that impacts us, and there's micro level stresses, the things that happen in our home, but also things that happen in society that also impact us, that can be traumatizing. Right. So, whether or not you believe this is morally correct or not, a woman's in the United States right now, it's not as free as it was to have reproductive rights. For some women, this is traumatizing, and the ramifications of that are traumatizing. So what I've learned is that trauma is in the eyes of the beholder. So what might be traumatizing to you may not be traumatizing to me, or what may be traumatizing for a child may not be traumatizing for an adult. And that becomes an important distinction, because I talk about trauma being big T and little t, which comes from the work of Francine Shapiro. And then what we've kind of added is cumulative trauma, which can be those big things that happen in life. But I can't say, for example, for you, what has been your cumulative traumas. I can say it could be that there was a typhoon, or there was a earthquake or something that happened in India, right? But that doesn't mean that it was traumatizing. So cumulative traumas are really something that a person would have to define for themselves, but can be more on the macro system level. But, big T traumas for an individual, you'll also have to ask. Big T traumas could be something like being sexually assaulted, having something that personally happens to your body, or happens. It doesn't have to happen to you. It can be vicarious.
Yeah, exactly.
Happen to someone else that you clearly love and really want to protect, but for whatever reason you couldn't. But also can be historical trauma. There's so much evidence of historical trauma, and there's people like Dr. Rachel Yehuda, who's doing really important research about can there be genetic markers, or can we actually, in the field of epigenetics, that our history, our historical history of our ancestors, how that impacts us in the present moment? I think there's so much interest in this area of trauma too, because we now have neuroscience of trauma. And one of the most important things when I talk about trauma is not only an experience of the mind, in terms of what we think and also of our emotions, but it's in the body. And in the last, like, say, 30 years, there has been more and more research that trauma is embodied. And that gives me to the next definition. There is some really important work that I think in terms of taking it out of self-blame. Because, so many people that have had trauma and maybe behaviors that go along with trauma sometimes feel like, I'm just broken. There's something wrong with me. And I like to say to people, no, there's something right with you. You are incredibly human. And for you to have gone through that experience affected your mind and body. And let me tell you about how toxic stress works in the body. So I help people understand very simply that we have a nervous system, and that when we have traumatic experiences or a series of them, something happens to our nervous system where there are different stress hormones that get turned on. And it's like we have the foot on the accelerator of our nervous system. And sometimes it starts happening when we're quite young, but we don't know that there's a brake, that we can put the brake on to get a respite from that acceleration of the stress hormones that are being pumped in our system without giving our nervous system a break. And so I think what I do as a trauma therapist and someone who's developed these different models is say, guess what? We could all have a break. I can teach you some very simple things that you could put a break onto those immense stresses that you're having in your life. It doesn't take away from the fact that this traumatic event happened to you, but it can help you be more in the present moment. The volume down on your body's reactions to stressful reminders of the trauma, like you said, the triggers that people talk about, right? And you can be feeling a little bit more present, so you can be more compassionate towards yourself and hopefully more compassionate towards others. I mean, it's so incredibly important. And there's just one more thing I want to say in terms of the answer to that. In 1997, there was a paper published in the United States, and it was called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And it was the first study of its kind that demonstrated that if you had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, that could be like a parent dying, could be a parent with an untreated mental health condition, it could be an incarcerated parent, domestic violence in the household. There's 10 altogether. I won't name all of them. But anyway, if you had 4 or more of these, that your health risks were so much more increased. So there was something that happened to your immune system, that your chances of getting, heart disease, pulmonary heart disease, and it was done, and it was conducted by a huge healthcare company in the United States called Kaiser Permanente in San Diego. And this was done primarily with middle and upper middle class families or individuals who had insurance, who had money, who had means, who were primarily white. And so now we have done many studies in terms of a wider group of populations saying, oh my goodness, people of color in our country, in my country, in the United States, have much more trauma in their life. So that could impact them, these adverse childhood experiences, because it affects the nervous system. And that's why I'm saying it is not your fault that this has happened, but you can now learn some skills to help you stay into your zone of well-being. So that,
and I want to come to that zone of well-being, the resiliency zone, because I think it's really important. It's a really important concept. So amazing. So if I could just, like there's a lot here, right? So trauma can be too much too fast, too little too long, too much too long. So there are different ways that trauma shows up. It's anything that happens to you in a way. There's an individual at the individual level, but also at a cumulative level, and there's also an intergenerational level, right? Which is kind of which is important as well. I love what you talked about, the neuroscience of the traumas in the body, the nervous system. And I'd love to dig a little deeper into that, right? Because, say, for example, there's if someone has a panic attack, for example, right? Would you put that in a small T, big T?
Oh, I think, well, it depends. Usually, panic attack, oftentimes people feel like they're going to die because they can't catch their breath.
Yeah.
And so that moment can be an existential moment.
Yeah.
And panic attacks can happen as a result of trauma, can happen as a result of stress. So I think that helping people understand their body in terms of panic attacks, I've had many people report, and we know in the models we've created that there's been a reduction in symptoms of anxiety and depression and an increase in well-being factors. But if you can pick up, sometimes when a panic attack happens, for example, sometimes the first sign is there might be a tension that you get. Now, if you feel that tension, go, oh no, there's a panic attack. I can't, I think, right? You feel like you're going to die. But if you, at that moment, you do something, and it could be as simple as putting your hands on the table and feeling the coldness and the hardness of a table, feeling your bottom in the chair, looking up and naming the colors in the room, you intercept this hijacking of the nervous system and help you to calm down so you don't go into a full-blown panic attack. So a really physiological reaction that happens, but it feels very life-threatening for many people when they have a panic attack.
And we'll go a little bit deeper into some of these practices, especially through your model. But if I come back to the science, so you have this attack. If you know the skills and the tips, you kind of come back to your well-being. But there's a lot of interesting science, and I'd love for you to go a little deeper into this of what physically happens, right? So there's a traumatic event. What physically happens in the body, which, from a science point of view, that needs to be integrated,
Well, I mean, I think that, it kind of goes back to what I was talking about, toxic stress. It's kind of it's like the unrelenting release in your body of different stress hormones that are meant for short action, but because of the consistent or the continuation of the traumatic events that sometimes happens in childhood, your nervous system never gets a break. And so basically what it kind of turns on this fear response that you really want to you want to escape from what's happening to you. But if you're little, you can't. All the adults are bigger than you. So we talk about thwarted survival responses. So you want to fight, you want to flee, you want to get away, but you can't. So there's a response that happens that's called tonic immobility, the more scientific term, but it's also more commonly called the freeze response.
Freeze, yeah.
Kind of like, and we have, deer in the United States, like deer in the headlights, or an animal who stops and you just see the blank stare going forward. Well, that happens to humans, and it happens to children, it happens to adults. But children often go into that freeze response when something is happening to them during childhood because it's too immense. So some of the theory is that when your nervous system gets stuck in those freeze responses, then it starts to change the physiology of your body. And so it also changes your reaction, because part of your brain, called the amygdala, is like your threat detector. But it's also an appraisal system. Right now, both of our amygdalas are working quite actively, assessing underneath our conscious awareness whether or not we're safe. Because I think one of the number one things I've learned is that we are designed for survival. So if, for example, if you're sitting in your room and a lion all of a sudden dashes through your door, would you say, oh, look at that sweet lion? Oh, do you want some lunch? I can feed you. Well, if you thought about that long enough, you might be that lion's dinner, right? So that we're designed to really have that flight response, to run to safety, or maybe to fight that lion. And there's also something that I call tending and befriending. You might have that lunch and say, here, take it, eat my lunch, but don't eat me, right? But for some of us, if there's an inescapable attack, we go into that freeze response, which, even though you can't move, it's the most activated response of the nervous system. And to kind of give a simple way of talking about it, there's some people that say it's like you have the sympathetic part of your nervous system, which is what gives you energy to like escape, it's hyper aroused state, that state gets locked into place with hypoarousal that makes you really stuck in space. So even though you look like this, your nervous system is still activated. It's like putting your car in park and gunning the engine. The car doesn't move, but it's still beating very fast on the inside, which is one of the things that's so hard about trauma that affects the body so significantly. Is you can be a child sitting in a classroom and you're, paying attention to the teacher, but all of a sudden the teacher raises their voice and starts saying, take out your mathematics book now. And all of a sudden the child goes into freeze response. Because the louder voice, even though it's not directed towards hurting that child, is your amygdala goes, ooh, this reminds me of dad when he hits mom. And all of a sudden that child is not paying attention. So for the teacher who doesn't understand, is not trauma informed, they may say, well, that child is not paying attention. You need to pay attention and start scolding the child. The child doesn't have a clue why all of a sudden his prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of his brain, went offline because of the loud voice, because that's not in our conscious awareness. So it's so important to know about the physiology, the science of what we call adverse child experiences, because it gives a new paradigm for teachers, for all of us, for family members to look at what's happened to someone. So instead of saying, oh, that person's bad because they're acting that way, which is really conventional thinking I see all over the world, we say, oh, I wonder what happened to Elaine. What happened to her that made her respond in that way?
And then, how would you, if I could just ask
yes,
you,
go ahead.
So if you're a teacher in this class, or say your colleague is having this and you can see this happen, how do you, what is the balance between sort of knowing that, okay, that there might be something going on, and kind of being understanding what was the trauma, what really happened? Do you really need to know, or it's kind of just from an empathy point of view that you're talking about, and then working with that?
Well, I think if I understand the question correctly, I don't think that I have learned that I don't need to know what happened to someone in order to help them. I think that's probably one of the most remarkable things, because as an old trauma therapist, I was trained in all sorts of ways to help people tell me their story. And that doesn't mean that listening with compassion and attention and space and time to someone's trauma story can be very healing for many people, but not for everyone. It just depends. But what I do know, if a person says to me, every time I think about what happened to me, my whole body starts to shake, but I don't want to tell you what happened to me. It's too gruesome. I'll say, well, you don't have to tell me. We can just start with the body. And let me ask you, and this is where the resiliency informed comes in, not only the trauma informed. Tell me what has helped you get through. Was there someone? Was there something? I say that most people, when I ask these questions like this, and I've asked them all over the world, there's usually 4 things that they say. And they begin with an F. I've created one as an F. Their family, their friends, their faith, and their fur babies. Societies that have cats.
Love it.
Not everybody takes dogs and cats into their homes in every country as we do in the United States, but in many countries, little furry creatures are very nourishing for people. So I call it the 4 Fs: family, friends, faith, and fur babies.
I think this is really big, right? Like what you just said, which is, I don't need to know the story to make a difference.
You don't need to know the story.
And I feel, and again, I don't know, you've been in the field more than I have, but I feel there's a lot of importance given to the story. And like you're saying, of course, in some cases it's really needed and you need it. And what you're saying is kind of work with the present and the future.
Well, and also, if you're going to work with the story, I've learned another important question. I ask about the end of the story first. Can you tell me the moment that you knew that you were going to live? Can you tell me the moment that help arrived?
Lovely.
Can you tell me the moment that you may have seen someone that you really care for after this thing happened to you, because those moments can be inspirational moments, not only in the heart and the mind, but in the body. People will often go, oh yeah, I remember my mom came and walked through the hospital, and I saw her come through the door, and I knew that I would be okay because she was there. And what's so curious about that, Young, I love that you asked me that question, is I've asked people that question. And I said, can you tell me the moment you survived? And people will look at me going, they almost can't speak. And then some of them will say, I don't know if I know that I've survived. And even though that sounds, how would you not know? Here you're sitting in front of me. Cognitively, you know that you survived, but the body doesn't know that you've survived. That has been such an eye-opening experience. So I'll say, well, I'm wondering what that would be like to notice in this present moment that you and I are here together. And I wonder if you can notice the aliveness in your body right now. And people will go, oh, I can feel my heart. Oh, I can feel my body in the chair. And it's kind of like, I haven't known for 10 years that my body hasn't known for 10 years that I'm alive. And that might be surprising for some people to hear. And that's why I'm so dedicated to, helping people understand their body and their body's place in this. Because what we didn't say, I've seen common reactions to trauma and stress all over the world. There's 6 domains. How we think, how we feel, spiritually, how we behave, our relationships, but our bodies. Many people who have trauma, they wouldn't say to you or me, oh, I have trauma. They'd say, oh, since that happened to me, my heart's not right.
Yeah.
Oh, since it happened to me, I have more pain in my body. I'm not sleeping as well. People talk about the physiological reactions, not necessarily even relating that these physiological reactions are connected to that traumatic event.
Yeah. Beautiful. I'm just putting in a couple of questions, and maybe this is a good time to go into the resiliency zone because this kind of answers some of it. Big T is beyond one's control. How does one face it without getting affected by it?
That's a great question.
Well, and if I could just, I don't know if you want to connect this to the resiliency zone, but I think it's very important.
Yeah, I can a little bit, but this is a very important question, the question that he's asked, because there are so many things. Talk about chaos, the name of your show. Chaos, to me, is sometimes the things that we have absolutely no control over, yet how do we create a space for ourselves, for our families in this chaos? And I think it doesn't take away the fact that that's existing. I just talked to these wonderful teachers in Ukraine yesterday. They're living in war. They never know when their city, when their house, when their community center, their church, their synagogue, their temple could be possibly bombed. That is definitely a big T trauma. But what do they do? And what have I shared with them that I think can be so amazing, and has been so amazing for them because they've told me so, but I've seen it all over the world, is knowing about what we call your zone of well-being. So this kind of fits in exactly. So we all have this zone of well-being. We call it the resilient zone. Children call it the okay zone, but it's kind of your natural rhythm of your vitality. So that's the yellow line would be the resilient zone. And so when we have that resilient zone, it doesn't mean that we're always calm and at peace in the resilient zone. It means that we can handle whatever happens to us in life. That, oh, well, yes, I'm sad because this is happening, but I can manage my sadness, or I can even be angry. But the anger doesn't take me into a place where I'm harming other people or harming myself. Sometimes righteous anger creates movements of change, right, in the world. I said righteous anger was certainly something I've ever read about India when you wanted to say the Brits need to go. That was many people in their resilient zone saying we need to mobilize to change the situation. Now, but when we talk about that cumulative trauma and also other kind of big T traumas, and even when I say little T traumas, I didn't mention this either. Little T traumas are a big T trauma to the person, but it might be, for example, I had a terrible dentist when I was a kid. He used to terrify me. And so every time I had to go to the dentist, I was going to some place where I felt I was being harmed. So even though that wasn't like, someone like a sexual assault, for me as a little child, that was very frightening. So that's an important distinction, be very careful with children because they're tender, and how you take them into situations that for an adult is no big deal, but for a child is a very big deal. But when you talk about the question about the cumulative trauma, which let's say you have these thunderbolts of whatever's happening in the world, and instead of being in this resilient zone, it's taking you to the high zone where you're just irritable, you're edgy, you're anxious, you're panicky, you sometimes yell and scream, and you say things to beloved people that you have to go and ask for forgiveness for later, or you do something that was not smart that could actually end up, you could end up in jail or having some kind of legal problem as a result of acting out of behavior in the high zone. But conversely, you can only stay up in that high zone so long before you crash into the low zone.
Yeah.
That low zone, it can be depression, disconnection, fatigue. I don't want to get out of bed. And some people go between the high and low zone because of traumas. In fact, also, I just want to say, I think that some people have been misdiagnosed with bipolar this condition who actually have trauma. And have gone through these high and low zones, and they've been misdiagnosed. And that doesn't mean people with bipolar condition can also have trauma. That can be, wedded together. Can be difficult. But I think that there are skills that you can learn, and I've learned this from the Ukrainians and many others, that when you are having a difficult cumulative trauma experience, what else is true about your life? What can you do at this moment that might be nourishing for you or for your family? And sometimes even a response to what's happening out there. Like for me, when the Ukraine war happened, it was a horrible thing to think about, anyone being killed, but especially children. And we know that's happening in Palestine right now. It's happened in Israel. It's happening in the Congo. There are many places in the world where children are suffering. And I wish I could help every single one of them. I know that I can't. But I know that I can do something in helping someone, perhaps in that country, learn these skills of well-being so that they can get momentary, even a few second respites to say, oh, what else is true about me? I'm a compassionate person. I'm going to help my neighbor and I'm going to take them a casserole or some lunch because I know that their husband is in the front and they're having a difficult time.
Yeah.
So sometimes those small acts of generosity.
And I think that's the the inner leadership piece that I kind of want to keep coming back to, which is, and what you're saying is, this identity of a mental health issue or grief is just one part of us, right? It's not our entire being.
It's not our entire being,
and when you marry that with the skills of how do you deal with the traumatic event. I'm reminded of Viktor Frankl's quote, right? He says, in between stimulus and response is a gap. In that gap lies our freedom and our growth. And it feels like this resilient zone in a way is that gap. Can we, between that response and stimulus, how do you kind of respond? And I feel the skills that you're talking about help us come back into the resilient zone. And hopefully the idea is to kind of, however high or low it is, you kind of come back sooner, right? In some way.
Well, that's right, because I'm glad you mentioned that, because all of us can go into the high or low zone. I've been in the high zone. I've been in the low zone.
Yeah.
Daniel, have you been in the high zone and the low zone?
Hell yeah.
Yes. Oh, yes. But if we stayed there, that would be problematic for us and everybody who lives with us and we love, right? But the thing is recognizing, and I know, like for me, I mean, I'm not perfect at it, but when I am getting into the high zone, my ears start to get really hot. And I go, oh God, I'm getting there. It's almost like we have colloquialism in the English language that even says that, oh, she was getting so hot that she was losing her mind, right?
Yeah.
So we have colloquialisms that describe sensations. But in my view, we haven't paid enough attention on the sensations of well-being that I do absolutely believe is possible for each one of us to start nourishing the well-being that is the wellspring inside each one of us.
Beautiful. So there are two aspects. One is three probably. One is the knowledge of this system and the nervous system and how this functions, which you talked about beautifully, including the science. There's another, which is the important questions you ask yourself, realizing that this is not me. How do you kind of come back into the resiliency zone? And the last, I feel, which is where I'd love to get, your views on kind of the actual skills, right? And what you left off with was, I know you call this body literacy, kind of understanding what's happening in your
Yes.
body and working with that. So if you could just speak a little bit about that, because I think that's
Well,
really,
I love to talk about this, Daniel.
yeah,
You're going to have to give me the hook and get me off your show.
I will.
Talk about
I will.
this.
I'll just say this way. Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, body literacy, I want to tell you what that is. I'm going to give you the fancy term, which is neuroscientists are studying what's called interoceptive awareness. And that is the capacity to pay attention to your body sensations. And so we all do that, like wherever you live in the world. So I live in California. And so we had a huge storm last week. So if I would have gone outside, it was cold and it was wet. If I would have gone outside with my bathing suit on and I would have walked outside, what would I have noticed? I'd say, oh my gosh, Elaine, what are you wearing your bathing suit for?
Yeah.
And it's cold. So I would have gone inside the house, changed my clothes, put a coat on, right? And I probably had an umbrella. Well, so my behavior was directed by me experiencing body sensations that were directing an action. The same would be true if you went outside. I've been to India. I think when I was there, it wasn't too hot, but I understand it can be hot in some places, just like in the United States. But if you went outside when you're in India and it was very hot outside, but you were wearing a wool coat, mittens, and a hat, what would you do, Daniel? Would you stay outside in this outfit or would you change it? I think you'd probably change it, right? Because it would be much, much too hot to wear that. So or everyone who's listening, you're already reading your sensations, but you haven't necessarily been paying attention to the sensations connected to your well-being. And so that's called interoceptive awareness. So scientists have found that when you start developing that interoceptive awareness about your well-being, that you actually can control your emotions better and also have better impulse control. Just like me.
Just give us an example. So you talked about knowing, and those are examples I feel that everyone can relate to.
That's right.
Give us an example with, say, an anxiety.
Okay, so let's say that I'm really anxious and about something. And so I would go, what am I noticing inside my body? Oh, my stomach is feeling really tight. I'm feeling some pressure and tightness in my shoulders. It could be different for every single person.
Yeah.
The question would be, what am I noticing on the inside?
Yeah.
And so you may be noticing a lot of tension inside the body, tightness in the belly, let's say tightness in the shoulders. Oh, I notice my breathing is more shallow and it's faster. So then that I can know that in a nanosecond, right? What's happening in my body, because I don't want to stay with the anxiety. So I want to shift my awareness to something else. So one of the things that I can do with this interoceptive awareness, right, is noticing those sensations of distress. Is there any sensation of well-being in my body right now? And there often is, even if it's small. So I'm going, oh, well, even though I feel that in my belly, in my stomach, my feet feel okay. Well, I wonder if I just bring attention to my feet and my legs. And like right now I'm moving them. And all of a sudden I notice, oh, the tension in my shoulder has lessened. I can feel that whatever was in my belly is starting to dissipate. And then what's important about body literacy is paying attention to the body changing. Because what happens when there's a lot of anxiety, there's also release sensations that sometimes can be misinterpreted by people. You might start tingling, and the tingling is about the nervous system coming back and establishing balance. You might even burp. So that's peristalsis coming back in. Your digestive system's working a little bit better.
I want to talk about that because this is something I've been doing this work now myself, and this is something that really surprised me. Right, one is the fact that your nervous system comes back into regulation, like if you just let it to be, right? And what that then means is you're back in your resiliency zone. That's one. And then the second is this, what you talked about, that energy release. Something's happening in your body, and whether it's the burps, the farts, the tears on your eyes, something is happening. Just say a little bit about that, because I think that's really,
Well, so the
really important.
release sensations of the autonomic nervous system are very important to maintain and to come back to homeostasis or balance, as we call it, or we could call it within your resilience zone. And so, but those sensations can seem like, what is that? I'm burping, I'm yawning. A yawn actually re-oxygenates the body. When I'm having a release sensation, I'm usually yawning, but it also can be a little trembling. And some people say, why am I trembling? And they try to stop it. I said, oh, no, no, let that come out. Does it feel like something's leaving you or something's stuck? And they go, no, it feels like something's leaving me.
Yeah.
You know, so I said, well, just let it happen in the way that it wants to, and let your body move the way it wants to. And that's why in the English language, you know, we say, oh, you're shaking it out. Again, another colloquialism, right? That's already ingrained. Shake it out, right? So that's an important rebalancing of the nervous system. But those sensations can seem a little bit strange. And also, I mean, there's different ways that different cultures look at yawning, for example, that when I was growing up, if I would have yawned in the classroom, the teacher would have said, why are you yawning, Elaine? Pay attention. So what we know now is that when you're yawning, let's say it's not such an interesting lecture, you're actually reoxygenating the brain so that you can pay attention better. I mean, we have misinterpreted the releases of the autonomic nervous system, and we sometimes have given judgment to them, including tears. I was on a call with a group of teachers in India last year, and I was talking about the medicinal qualities of tears. There's actually research studies, which is connected to this whole sensory release, right? And so when we are experiencing emotional tears, it actually releases a hormone called oxytocin into our body. That is one of the hormones that is connected to relaxation in our body. And it actually can increase endorphins when we cry. But so I will never forget this. So there was like, 100 people on the call. She unmutes herself and she goes, are you serious? Really, is this true? And I said, I'm going home to my family tonight. And all these years they've been telling me I'm weak, that I've really been resilient. I go, you have been. These tears are for releasing and for your endorphins to come back. So everyone who tells a little boy not to cry, I'm going to say, it's okay to cry. Just notice your tears, because they're your body healing. Wouldn't that be wonderful if we could change that societal norm that many people have about not crying?
Love it. I'm just gonna. There are some questions that I'm not able to see. Okay, Satyam says, I'm not able to put it up here, but she says, how's working with trauma happened in past different from working with trauma that is current and ongoing?
That's a great question. I think
we'll come back to the skills part as well, but this is, I think this is really important.
I'm loop that in, but I think that when you've had past trauma, first of all, it can come into the present moment feeling like it's happening right in the present moment. So there's something that is called implicit memory that we have, it's kind of body memories, where we say we're in the market and we smell a certain smell, and that smell is connected to someone who caused us harm. We all of a sudden may say, all of a sudden your body you want to leave everything that you have in your basket and you want to run to outside or run to your car. You don't even know why. So that we have this implicit memory that is like a warning system. And we explain it simply calling them memory capsules that kind of can pop because of some cue or trigger in the environment, right? And then we have this particular reaction. So that's so linked to those traumatic experiences. And this is where some of the skills come in, because once we start recognizing, oh, it's every time I smell that perfume. So then you can say, oh, I'm going to bring in an image of some smell that I like. And I can think of, let's say, the smell of lavender or sage. And then that can turn the volume down on that smell that's linked to the traumatic memory.
So there are two things that come, sorry to interrupt, but I'm going to do my backup routine. There are two things that come to mind, which is, one is in some ways, if that memory capsule, there are probably lots of memory capsules.
Which is from the past, yes.
Which is from the past, and on some level, that can be, scary or paralyzing in a way that says, something can trigger me. It can go. I don't really know the story. That's one piece. And I guess what you're saying is if you know the skills, you kind of deal with it in the present.
That,
But
and
then
you can
the second
know
part,
the sensory system, which is one of the reasons why I don't have to know the story. I can know the sensations and help that person create a new kind of pathway of well-being by sensing their, a sensation connected to something that provides support for them, for example.
and and I mean, if that was me, I would be curious about, why is that causing me, this reaction, right? And is that when you kind of go back into the story, or I know you're saying it's not necessary, but
I would say if someone says why, I say, well, because your body's designed to keep you alive. And that experience was an existential threat, a life and death experience for you. And maybe you didn't see it at the time, but your body's saying, run, take care, you're in danger right now. So your body is so incredibly normal because it's actually giving you a reminder of this thing happened to you. Because the other thing about that, maybe they remember what happened to them, Daniel, but they may not. Sometimes whatever has happened to us, or what happened to us when we were so young, that we don't have an explicit factual memory of it, but our body has a memory of it. Like an example of that, one day I was picking up a friend who's from Kenya, from the airport in Los Angeles, and I have a little small white fluffy dog. Really, it looks like a little teddy. It looks like a stuffed animal. And so I brought the dog in the car with me, and I didn't know that my friend was terrified of dogs. So I pick her up, and she sees the dog in the car. She literally had a look of horror on her face and backed away from the car. And she started to cry. She goes, Elaine, I'm so afraid of dogs. I mean, the dog is literally this teeny, fit in my palm of my hand. But see what it says, it's perception, right?
Yeah.
Her. And so she doesn't know when it happened, but she sees a dog. So I worked with the skills because I go, well, I got to get her in the car and get her home. It's about an hour drive back to my house. But by the time I helped her, the dog was sitting on her lap.
Oh, wow.
The dog. Now, she thought that was quite remarkable, actually.
Can we go a little bit into that, if you don't mind, and
so,
link it to the skills? Because one of the things you talked was, be aware of your body, be aware of what's happening in your body. And one of the things, the first thing you said was maybe start to shift your attention to one part of your body that is feeling good. Right? That was one thing I got. Share a little bit about the other skills.
Well, I think in the community resiliency model, there's 6 skills. The first one is tracking, which is paying attention to your sensations, not just the ones of distress, but to start cultivating the ones of well-being. And to say it simply, I often say, if you have a garden and you want to grow vegetables, and you plant your vegetables in the spring time, and let's say that in your garden there are weeds that you decide, I'm just going to water the weeds in my garden this year. What would happen to the vegetables that you need for nourishment? They would wither. They would not be as plentiful. And that's what sometimes we do, and we're so stuck on just talking and talking and talking about the trauma because we can't get off that conveyor belt. Trauma, trauma, trauma. So what I'm saying, what would it be like to step off and to start paying attention to those vegetables in your garden and putting some more water on them? And that's paying attention to the sensations of it.
So that's tracing, tracking.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. Now, that doesn't mean that it changes you overnight, but in time, because we know that through a concept called tuning the nervous system, there's something called tuning and pruning. It's from neuroscience. When we tune and we pay attention to the positive experiences in our life, it actually can start to change the chemistry of our brain. It takes time. It's not going to happen overnight. But if you start,
like a muscle.
It's a practice. Paying attention to that. And then over time, pruning happens. What is pruning? It's like when you prune a tree and cut back the leaves of a tree, right? Is that what it's also called the use it or lose it principle. So the less that you use it, then it's not going to be like, if it's a trigger, for example, of a traumatic experience, it's not going to be as reactive. It's like if you've ever been in a pathway, like in a meadow, and you're on a path, but there's one that's next door, but you can't hardly see it because people aren't traveling on it any longer. It's still there faintly, but
Yeah.
you're on the one that's very well worn. And
I
that's
could
what,
pause. Sorry, Elaine, since you've given me permission.
yes.
I could just pause, also conscious of your time. So we talked about tracking. So we've got
Yeah.
that. Say a little bit about the next skill.
Well, the next one is resourcing, but that's about that pathway.
Yeah, that's
Because
about
the more
right.
that you pay attention to those resources in your life, and that can be anything, that it lifts you, brings you peace, brings you calm. It can be that existential moment of the moment you survived. For me, it's often I think of my granddaughter, places in nature. I can start describing them to myself. I just feel a great sense of wellness when I do that.
Beautiful.
Yes. And
Almost like a bank. It's like a
you
know,
have
you
a bank of resources
beautiful.
inside of you. Now, every now and then you may encounter someone that has difficulty. And I do want to say something because you have an international audience. If a person is hungry, sensing the body can be difficult because hunger is existential. And sadly, it sometimes can be very difficult to sense pleasant sensations when the overriding sensation is that of hunger. But I think that's something that we need to look at as a world society, is how we, eliminate that. So I'm just adding that because it can be more difficult. Yeah. So resources are the second skill. The third skill is grounding, and that's just your attention to your body in the present moment.
Yeah.
And the fourth skill is gestures. And we just say gestures. How is that? Is that I have heard that most of us have a self-soothing gesture that we do automatically without thinking underneath conscious awareness. I do this. I put one thumb on top of the other and I just gently stroke my other thumb. And when I do that, I just took a deeper breath. I also, at night, I rub one leg against the other leg to get to sleep at night. It's very comforting to me. So my daughter does this to her hair. She twirls her hair. But sometimes the things that we do that are self-soothing, other people say it and go, stop it, right? Sometimes moving the leg very rapidly can be annoying to others, but actually helps to regulate the nervous system. So I really encourage all of you to think about, like if you do this, Daniel, if you have a self-soothing gesture, to know that you can do it with intention and then with paying attention to the sensations, and that can help the nervous system come back.
Lovely.
So simple.
So beautiful.
Who knew?
And I'm reminded also about children, right? Because we kind of look at a child and there's something which we see as, like something weird, or even like sucking their thumb, and we keep saying remove it, remove it, remove it. And it is self-soothing in a way. And if we know this, I think it's really important.
Well, and I think, of course, we want them not to suck their thumb with water, but I have this. This is also a self-soothing gesture for me. I used to suck my thumb. I think this is a remnant from the self-calming I used to do as a baby, but I can do this now and feel this sense of calm. And of course, that's appropriate to do and not suck my thumb as an older person too, right? Because we want to move out of that.
And these are gestures that you already have.
You already
kind of paying attention, which then allows you. I mean, you need to kind of track it in your body, how it's helping you. It is a resource. It helps you ground.
And also, it's very individualized, Daniel. So you can't. I say, "Hey, Daniel, do this. You're gonna do better." Well, you can say that's nothing for Elaine, but doing this does something for me, right? So you.
And your last, sorry.
Okay, and there's two more skills.
Yeah. Okay. Two more.
So there's skill 5 that are a group of 10 strategies that if you are way in your higher low zone, and all those other skills don't work, that you have a drink of water, you go for a walk, you pay attention to colors. There's 10 that help it's in some ways it helps to distract the mind in order to bring the body back into balance. Many schools love the Help Now strategies because they help children come back into that zone of well-being quite quickly. And the 5th one is called Shift and Stay. And that's shifting from distress to a resource, to grounding, to a self-soothing gesture, to one of the Help Now strategies, to come back into that zone of well-being. It's kind of like the recap.
Summary.
Yeah.
Summary. Amazing. Listen, we are at time, but I'd love to spend 5-7 minutes if that's okay with you.
You have 5 or 7 minutes. You can even have 10.
Oh, amazing. Okay. I'm going to use it. Might not abuse it. Okay, people who are here, this is your opportunity to ask Elaine a lot of questions. This is a treasure trove of wonderful wisdom and knowledge. Okay, let's change gears a little bit. Let's take the big, and I want to maybe put two questions in one. And so there's one thing about what have you learned, and this is kind of moving away from the individual to the larger in some ways. And I think this is something which, given that we are in this world which is crazy and all these multiple crises are happening, like just how do we balance that with the collective suffering in the world? And I know you've talked a lot about the strategies, but I'm just wondering if there's something.
This is a big struggle that I have, of course, and I think that I'll say one thing, is be careful about social media and our wonderful phones that we love to be so attached to. When we get little blurbs about what's happening in the world, I think sometimes those are disruptors of our nervous system that can take a perfectly good day and knock us out of our zone. And then if we don't work actively to get back in, it can be hard to get back in. So, some people say taking some time off, or maybe a 2-hour period where it's no social media, and if you're watching too much news, the news tends to be very negativistic. So I think it would be a good idea to limit that amount of input in terms of that kind of chaos that you don't have control over. But I think that the individual stress, for me, I'm just going to tell you something personal, that I work on trying to remember what else is true. And so, for example, in Ukraine, I really believe that we should be supporting money to Ukraine right now to help them in their war effort. But we have an American Congress that's, in my estimation, is a little out of whack right now.
Yeah.
And even though the Senate just said yes, the House of Representatives may not. That really brings me individual stress. And because I know so many Ukrainians, I know that it makes a huge difference for human survival. So, I mean, those are hard things, but I think I can just say, okay, Elaine, what can I do right now? Right now, I can help my Ukrainian educators that I have ongoing relationships with know these skills. I can help support them, that if they need to talk to me for some reason, because something new has come up that they didn't expect regarding the use of the skills, I can be there for them. And so, I mean, I know that when I'm of service, that helps me, even with the chaos that's happening in the world. Because collective chaos is made up of individual chaos, right? And it multiplies. So there is a Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute says in one of their algorithms, they're very smart mathematicians, smarter than I am, that if we can have 10% of a population begin to wildly believe something is true, that it changes the 90%. Now, some of you are saying, well, could be negativity, which is the reason why don't do so much of that social media, but start really doing the 10% of the people in your life about positivity, about tuning in positive ways your nervous system and the nervous systems of others. That also leads to, this is important, Daniel, when we do that, I've seen something remarkable happen. We have more self-compassion. There's more blood flow going to our cortex. We have more self-compassion, and guess what? Then we have more compassion towards others.
I love that, and it gives me this image of, irrespective of what's happening externally, you find a safe space within yourself, and you act from that.
Well, there you go, the space and the chaos. Here we are
at the session. No, specific. Just want to express how captivating. Huge thanks to Elaine and Daniel. Thank you, Apurva. God bless you. Last question from an audience member. Is trauma inductive? If you see someone in traumatic and you're not unable to help, does it induct trauma in you?
It can. I think it can. I mean, I think for me, especially when they're really tightly connected to us, I think for many of us, when we see our children suffering and we can't help them, I always feel there's this invisible umbilical cord that still exists between me and my kids. And now my grandchildren, and then it comes out, right? But we may have that with non-related people. And it can be so painful to not being able to help them. And that can be that vicarious trauma. So if that is happening to anyone who's listening, I'd say, cultivate your well-being. We have a free app called iChill that any of you could get on your phone. It's in English, Spanish, and Ukrainian. We plan to add more languages. We just got a big donation, thank goodness, to add Arabic, and Hebrew. So we'll be adding those. And I think there's more possibilities to add more languages. I don't know. There's so many dialects in India, though, Daniel. I don't know if we could do that, but we certainly
maybe that's what I should be doing now.
Maybe that's what you should be doing. Maybe you'll be our voice of iChill in India. There you go.
2 questions.
You want me to answer this question? I don't know if you froze or what have your challenge?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that first of all, that not every trauma treatment, like the ones even that I've been developing for all these years, are going to help every single person. So to know that there may be an array of different things that may help someone, and to explore different ways. I think ways to move the body. There's so many ancient traditions in many cultures that can be so helpful. Yoga can be very, very helpful. Trauma-informed yoga, for example, or any kind of Tai Chi movement of the body. But I think the challenges have taught me humility. I mean, I've been humbled many times thinking that something could be right. But as the older that I get, I've learned to kind of go with the flow, that some things are helpful and some things aren't for every single person. Trying to be open to the curiosity that exists in the world about helping and healing. And sometimes the challenges have been difficult. It can be difficult to be a woman leader in patriarchal systems. So I have a lot of battle wounds that I cover up. But I feel like I've always had a purpose that was bigger than me. I feel that not so much that I chose it, that it chose me. And I've been driving the bus for a while. And I'll turn over the bus to someone else in the future that will drive the bus in another new way. But maybe that will be a conversation for another time that has to do with paying attention to kind of signs around me that were nudging me to do this work that I've been doing for 20 years.
Beautiful. Yeah. Thank you so much. That is such a gift, what you've just shared with us. Okay, last question that I ask all the guests on my show. What does stillness and chaos mean to you? When you hear that phrase, is there an image? Is there something that comes to mind for you?
Well, I think we've been talking about it really, is that, the chaos, the cumulative traumas, that big T, little t traumas, too much, too fast, too little for too long, too much for too long, that we need a pause every now and then. I may call it a resiliency pause, a well-being pause, to be still, kind of to listen to the rhythms of our own heart, our own spirit, and whether that's pausing to take time for ourselves to go for that walk, or whether that's launching a social movement. Oftentimes from the stillness comes great creativity and great nourishing for ourselves and others.
Oh, that's so beautiful. When I play this back, I'm going to focus on that phrase you just used. It's so beautiful. Listen, thank you, Elaine, for your incredible wisdom, the knowledge, your depth of knowledge in this space is such a gift to all of us. And there's so many things that I've taken away, including the skills, the tributary of hope is something that's it's just present for me, especially in this day and age. And the fact that each of us can find a space in ourselves, especially when the world is so much very chaotic. So thank you again. God bless you.
It's an honor to be here with you and your guests. Yes.
And thank you for those who've joined us. The next episode is in a couple of weeks with Simon Hempel, the serial entrepreneur. We're going to be talking about how do we lead a spiritual life in our everyday life. And spiritual can just mean how do I have a light spirit. So Would love to have everyone there. Thank you so much. Good night. Have a good day.
Good night.
Elaine,
Thank you.
you.
Thank you,
Take care.
Daniel.
Bye.
Talk to you soon, hopefully.
Yes, for sure.